I thought I would start by reading my blurb. Fabio asked if I would do a blurb for the book. That's the 50-word something on the back cover. And I was really happy to do it because I write books about food politics. This book is about food politics. So, my blurb. Parasecoli draws on his deep international experience in this thoughtful analysis of how food gets ensnared in political ideology to separate us from them. Gastronativism argues convincingly that food systems are indeed global, and the sooner we get those systems to bring people together, the better. So I wanted to end this on a note of hope, because what I got out of Fabio's presentation and out of reading this book is that humans are tribal. Deeply, deeply tribal. And that must be hardwired into our psychology in ways that make this kind of food ideology possible. And, I remember growing up in a secular Jewish family that didn't observe much, fierce arguments about whether matzo balls should float or sink. Fierce arguments about whether you put sour cream into borscht. Fierce arguments about how you did a Passover Seder. It was, I'm right and you're wrong. And you're not part of my family if you do this in another way. And I remember many examples of couples marrying and trying to do their own traditions and having to fight the traditions in the family because they did them differently. So I had a couple of things that just absolutely leaped to mind. One was the historical immigration of Italians into the United States. And I'm a nutritionist, and the enormous effort of nutritionists to try to get those Italians to stop eating those pasta and tomatoes. And instead eat white bread and whatever else they were doing. The irony of it is just absolutely amazing, but there was this enormous medicalized effort that went into trying to change the diets of the poor Italians and the complaints about the way the food smelled. This was not considered a delicious smell, it was considered lower class. And the classism, now racism, and other kinds of isms that go into this seem to me to be, as I said, I think they're hardwired into the psyche of people, and to overcome that kind of thing requires an enormous effort. And I always think of the Yugoslavian example when I think of this, because under Tito, Yugoslavia was one country. It was one country, even though it was pluralistic and had many religions and many ethnic groups, and there were Serbs and Croats and all kinds of people there, they considered themselves Yugoslavian until a leader came in who deliberately sowed discontent, and neighbors who had lived together for decades suddenly were at war. If we're going to have a democratic society, we're going to have to figure out ways in which we can use food to bring people together and not separate them. And we have a food movement in this country. I've taught courses in food sociology, a little over my head, but I taught twice a course in social movements, trying to look at whether food is a social movement, and the ways in which pieces of the food movement resemble other social movements like the women's movement or the environmental movement or the civil rights movement, and ways in which it's very different. And there are similarities, but there are many, many differences. One is that there is no one movement. There are the organizations that are working on changing aspects of the food system are working on changes from agriculture to public health. And they don't really have much to do with each other. They're not united in any way. coalition building among food advocacy groups is extremely difficult because each of the advocacy groups has a leader and a staff, and they're raising money and competing with each other for raising money. And I think one of the first things we have to do if we're going to change the food system and have a food system that promotes health and sustainability is to bring all these groups together around common causes. I don't know how to do that. But I think it's the challenge for all of us, because otherwise we're dealing with the kinds of things that Fabio deals with in this book, which is, if you want to open up a Chinese vegan restaurant, you're going to have people picketing in front of your restaurant because you have offended the Chinese by doing that in some way. If you want to do a Mexican restaurant, you're going to run up against people who think that you're appropriating the food of people who aren't in a position to do what you're doing. I mean, these kinds of things go on all the time. I think it's very important in movements to know who the enemies are and who the friends are. And it's not something that is always very obvious. One of the things that happens with leftist movements is they eat their own. I think it's just critically important to know who is the enemy here. And the enemy here clearly is global capitalism, right? I mean, that's what everybody should be worried about, is the increasing corporatization of society, the increasing corporatization of food. Even the foods that are that push all the buttons, vegan, organic, locally grown, seasonal, whatever, they're owned increasingly by corporations. Corporations are buying them. PepsiCo just bought, I don't know how to pronounce it, Sishin, it's an energy drink. It's an energy drink sold as a supplement, and it's just been bought by Pepsi-Cola. So that's the kind of thing that we really should be concerned about, not somebody who thinks that borscht should be done one way rather than another. But this requires a political consciousness that most people would rather not have. I mean, my experience teaching courses in food politics is that students don't want to have anything to do with politics. It's dirty. It's corrupt. And I think if we're going to change the system and change it for the better, we have to get involved in politics because that's how you get power. And you can't change the system without power. I tell everybody, when people ask me what should I do, I say, run for office. Give us somebody to vote for. That would be really terrific. So those are the kinds of things that your book made me think about and your presentation made me think about. And I think it's just a remarkable piece of work. I never can get over, Fabio, how your observation of all of these different things, you pull them together in a way that is so coherent and makes such good sense. It's really an impressive piece of work. Thank you for doing it. And thank you for letting me comment on it.
Perfect. Thank you. And we're going to keep some time for your questions. So I'm just going to make some comments, building a bit on what Marion was saying. And Fabio, you don't have to respond to it. If you have time, you can respond. And you can talk to Fabio about it over a glass of wine, which is you can hear being prepared downstairs. I don't want to come in the way of it. So a couple of things. One is building on what Marion was saying. And I want, in some ways, more specification, okay? So I'm wondering, in some ways, the first question is cultural appropriation, arguments about cultural appropriation also forms of gastronativism? Question number one, okay? And if it is there a problem conflating the nativism of the strong with the nativism of the weak? Should we make distinctions between those two? Okay? Third, and this is again coming from very specific examples. What's beautiful about this book, it forced me to think about things broadly in a number of places, and India consumes me right now, partly because how disastrous gastropolitics is in India. To give you a sense, those of who may be unfamiliar, by last records, we have had lynching of about 150 people on the rumor of eating meat. So that's, and I think, and why that's important is, and that's my kind of, which is this question about, should we have a terminology that conflates the nativism of the weak and the strong, or do we need different terminologies for this? And India is a very good example, and I don't think India is the only example. China and Turkey are comparable examples where basically there's a conflation between party, state, and the mobilization of gastronativism to assault the minority. Okay? Then, so it comes to the third question. Should we be making distinctions between these cases when these are civil society movements and counter-movements and state power movements, okay? Which are building around, in some ways, if we stick to the three examples, India, China, Turkey, is about, what the theorists draw in to argue for, is the making of subjectivities, or what in the US we call identities. The idea of the Han, the Hindu, and the Turki, okay, is a mobilization of these identities. Do we need one term called gastronativism, or do we need more terms that distinguishes between civil society plus those in state power, and between the gastronativism of the strong and the gastronativism of the weak? For me, in some ways, one of the biggest challenges in this book is getting my head around your category of exclusion and inclusion. I get the exclusion, I don't get the inclusion yet. That also means I haven't read the book closely yet. I've flipped through it. So it's just a matter of being a better student. And towards that, my last comment is, if a food sovereignty movement is a form of gastronativism, okay, and the lynching of Muslim minorities is a form of gastronativism, why have the same term for two very different things? Because does that, in some ways, makes it impossible for the very politics that Marion is suggesting we should be doing, is to be able to make distinctions between friends and enemies. I'll stop there and give you some time to either respond or ignore my questions. Just tell me to read the book better and then open it up to some of your questions.
I'm going to let Fabio deal with this one.
No.
Yours.
This is...
We're having a department meeting. This one's yours.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I don't use the word inclusion. I say not exclusionary, because these are not inclusive movements. I make a difference in the book. But there is, my idea here was to point out how also very different expressions. So La Via Campesina, and I hope in the book I make clear that they are very different kind of expressions, are connected in some ways. They're using food to do certain things, and they're using food to express different forms of opposition to the same phenomenon, which is this sort of neoliberal globalization, a specific model of globalization, and that also I want to make clear. There could be different kinds of globalization. There have been different kinds of globalization. So now we're dealing with one specific. The idea behind the book is to try to connect all this movement in all their difference. And I try to underline the difference as much as possible. But I wanted to show how the root of much of what we're dealing with is not so much local politics or national politics. The horizon needs to be different. And it interacts with the local, the national, But I think the engine of these dynamics is not local or national. So that was the idea of figuring out one concept that covers everything. That does not deny the profound differences between exclusionary, what I call exclusionary nativism, or non-exclusionary nativism. And I put them also physically in different chapters because I wanted to clarify this difference, but I also wanted to point out that in their difference, they are somehow the result, a reaction against the world in which we live that is structured according specific model of capitalism. And it's not just any capitalism. It's one specific model of capitalism that we're living through. So that was a little bit the idea behind it.
Yeah, your comment about India was another Yugoslavian example. It's the same sort of thing where the state is using, in this case, diet to do what it wants to do, which is to get rid of the Muslim minority.
120 million people. There's no way to get rid of it. That's what the ruling party has to figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Gonna be
so
tough to get rid
yeah.
of.
And in India, small numbers are very big numbers. You know. So it's like, yeah, no. But you're absolutely right. Let's open it up to some comments and your questions and thoughts, reflections. Yes, please.
Food comes from the family. Food originally, things of, and I was thinking as you discussed this, that there's a similarity between halal, the Muslim, and the kosher, and whether that might be something that could lead to conversation
No, like in New York City, I mean, that's how people get there. Until they get halal, they get kosher.
Yeah.
No, so I'll let Fabio respond
Also,
to it. Yeah.
in Rome, traditionally, Muslims would go to Jewish butchers to get their meat. So in practice, it was not a problem. Only later, when you start also having, halal butchers and you start having a pushback against the Muslim, problems start coming up. In Rome, the Jewish community has been there for 2,000 years. They are as Roman and as anybody else. The Muslims are not. And so as the community grew, also the fear of invasion, this idea of clash of civilizations, became very strong, and that made the difference between halal and kosher quite evident.
Other questions, thoughts, comments? Yes. Louder.
Much louder.
Yes, that's good.
When you think of halal and kashrut, like those are the ultimate divisions, dividing, right? You talk about food as an instrument of dividing. It was very early on.
Can't hear you. Son, shout.
I will try to shout.
Good, better. Better.
Saying that kashrut and halal are very early systems of division. We don't eat pork, they eat pork. We don't drink wine, they drink wine. How do you think of those systems of setting people apart? How do you think of those dietary divisions? How do you think of them in
this-
to these more modern divisions? Do you see them as
Yeah, yeah. I see them quite separate. I mean, of course, food has always been a tool for identity. What's happening here, when kashrut developed, the Jewish community was not fighting globalization, was fighting for a specific place. What I see here is that some of those traditional divisions that had always been there are being used either as weapons to attack or to defend in this new situation that we're living in. And it's pretty recent, as I was pointing out, it's 40 years that we have this sort of globalization. So it's not that food before was not used to create identities or delimit communities. Actually, Christianism, when they developed, one of the first things is like, we're different because we don't have differences. We eat everything, right? So that was also very, very important, and all religions have got their foods. But I think the political use that we see now respond to specific new conditions that are different from what was there before.
Fran, are we supposed to stop here and go drink? What? How many? Couple of more questions? Okay, and one quick thing on piggybacking on it. I think that's an important one in your book, is how to think of the temporal scheme, right? Because you also say it is now, but your word you're using is nativism, which you say is from 1850. So is it now, is it then, or is it like, say, the halal, kashrut division? When does this temporality break off? Like any analysis, in some ways, and that's partly a challenge, right? What is continuous and what is discontinuous? And what I like about your book is it poses the question about it, in some ways, you cut it up in a particular way, which you are last 40 years, okay? And of course, like anything in human history, there's some degree of continuity, and how do we think of these other temporalities? Excellent, sorry, yes. Question about India, okay. Yep. Beef is also being consumed, but also buffalo. And so it's called buff in India, but often happens like any, and that's one of the challenges, like any ground up social movement, these are not rationalists defining very fine boundaries, because the point is to target the people you want to target, okay? And so one could sit down with them and have an argument. They're eating buffalo, so spare them, kill those who are eating beef. But it doesn't work, because of that, what Fabio is saying is this violent mobilization of identity, which has in India, again, it's the temporality, has always had a long history of this. This is not the first time. Gandhi wrote about all these questions 100 years ago. In a very sophisticated and a complicated way. And so, you're absolutely right. I wonder why certain kinds of mobilizations succeed in certain points of time, and Fabio's book provides one kind of answer to that. He says it is about forms of, in some ways, associating all forms of transnationalism, an Islamic identity, which one of the Hindu project there is to define Islam as a foreign religion, although it has been there for about 1,000 years, okay? But it is also, and this is what makes it more complicated, Muslim elites have ruled India for 1,000 years. So it's quite different from other kinds of relationship. So that's the specificity, and what is the general question, and what is the particular question, and what are these specific questions? So excellent point, and I think we would need to kind of slice it finer and thinner to be able to answer some of these questions. And Fabio's answer, what I read from his book, what I want to engage with, is that there's something about this moment that allows you to do this. Is that right, Fabio?
So, for instance, UNESCO is working a lot on food heritage, but their version is not, let's say, a gastronativist approach. They say, let's try to celebrate. let's celebrate difference, let's celebrate identities. The world is what it is because we're different. It can become a tool of gastronativism if there are political forces that instead of using one's traditions or one's heritage to celebrate difference, they use it to isolate others. Of course, countries have used that also for commercial reasons. The example of champagne, and I mentioned briefly in the book, but I've written a whole book about just that. It's part of trade regulations, so that only if champagne is made in Champagne can be called champagne, otherwise it doesn't. So that's something that exists, but if in the case of champagne, champagne was used somehow, it's not. But imagine if it was used to exclude, I don't know, other communities. In that case, I would maybe start talking about an aspect of gastronativism. Well, that article is quite interesting also because, as you know, in our class we had somebody working precisely on that issue. What does it mean for an adoptee to live in a family that, you know, eats something different? The issue of appropriation, it's quite complicated. And this somehow connects to what Krishnendu was saying, you know. Are you talking from the point of view of the weak, trying not to defend privileges, but actually to get somewhere where they were not? Or are you talking about somebody who's privileged and it's trying to maintain their privilege as much as possible? I think that's an important distinction to make. So it depends on the situation. I mean, who's appropriating and who's in a position of power and can do things that the others cannot do? Are people trying to get, you know, to equality? Or are people trying to defend their privileges in any way they perceive them?
Yes, so thank you to Marion, Fabio, and Krishnendu. I invite you again to come to the exhibition, Food Bigger Than the Plate. Many of the topics that were part of this conversation are part of the show, but it translates to New York City specifically, to the history of New York specifically. And so it's not only a celebration of our extraordinarily diverse and rich restaurant and eating history, but also a very beautiful take on many of these problems, because it's mostly an art show. So we're gonna have a lot of history, but we're gonna have, which is interesting because what Fabio, Marion, and Krishnendu brought here is this very rational, analytical take at some of these global issues. But what we're gonna have in the gallery is some of that, but also the more poetic, metaphorical engagement with the topics. And so now, I invite you all to have a glass of wine with the author and with the panelists. You can buy the book in our bookshop, and Fabio will sign the book for $100 paid to me. I'm gonna be in the corner, and so yes. So thank you so very much for the motivating conversation.